lesson is the nature of science, studying animals. Biologists study behavior through observation and experiments. Experiments show that both genes and experience or the environment affect behavior. Social behaviors are important adaptations in many species. Animal behavior is what an animal does as it interacts with the environment. Scientists rely on two approaches to explore life. One is discovery, which is observation and careful description, and one is hypothesis-based science, which is testing explanations and using experiments. Discovery or observation example is Jane Goodall that we talked about previously. Experimentation, here's an example. Tim Burgon discovered digger wasps and how they behaved. He used simple materials such as pine cones and stones and a simple procedure. The results led him to conclude that digger wasps use a pattern of landmarks to find their nest. So in this picture here, in number 1, a digger wasp carries food or a paralyzed bee back to her nest. When the landmarks are moved, the wasp follows the landmarks rather than returning to the nest. So in number 2, it tried to go to the wrong site. Changing the landmarks reveals that the wasp responds to the arrangement of landmarks rather than the type of landmark. So in this case, it was a circle that it was responding to, not a triangle. Tim Burgon's studies look for the immediate cause of the wasp behavior, an explanation of the organism's immediate interactions with the environment. But behavior biologists also ask why questions. Why do organisms behave as they do? Answering why questions involves finding the ultimate cause of the behavior, an explanation based on the organism's voluntary evolutionary adaptations. Researchers have observed that digger wasps raised in isolation build nests in the same way as wasps raised among other wasps. A behavior that is performed correctly by all individuals of a species, even if they have no previous experience with that behavior, is called innate behavior. A fixed action pattern, or abbreviated FAP, is an innate behavior that occurs as an unchangeable sequence of events. So here in the picture, the goose sees an egg outside the nest and retrieves it. And then the goose completes the same sequence of motions even if the egg is removed. So in the third set of pictures, the egg is removed, but the goose still tries to move it closer to its feet. This type of innate rhythm with a cycle of about 24 hours is called a circadian rhythm. And this is a chart of the effect of light on flying squirrel activity. So the control group squirrels, where they had time at the bottom and day of experiment, and the experimental group on the right shows that light cues gave more activity. So the more blue, the more activity. So as the light was changed, the experimental group, there was more activity. Circadian rhythms are controlled by an organism's internal biological clock. A change in an animal's behavior resulting from experience is called learning. A simple form of learning is habituation, in which an animal learns not to respond to a repeated stimulus that it conveys little or no important information. Some of the most interesting cases involve imprinting. Imprinting is a learning that is limited to a specific time period in an animal's development called the critical learning period, and that is usually irreversible. The picture on the right shows a famous experiment conducted by Konrad Lorenz, who observed imprinting when he raised a group of newly hatched goslings by hand and found them that they imprinted on him, so they followed him everywhere. Learning that a particular stimulus or particular response is linked to a reward or punishment is called conditioning. So number 1, the dog salivates when it smells food. Number 2, a dog does not salivate when it hears the sound of a bell because it's not associated with food. In number 3, in an experiment, Pavlov rang a bell every time he fed the dog. Eventually, the dog associated the bell with food. It salivated every time it heard the bell, even if no food was present. So Ivan Pavlov has something called classical conditioning to his credit. Here's a cartoon. And then, instead of feeding me, he would ring the little bell. Here's another one. Bell rings, I get a treat. Bell rings, I get a treat. It went on that way for days. Then out of the blue, bell rings, I get nothing at all. Nada. I mean, can we seriously call my attack unprovoked? The dark truth about Pavlov's dogs. Animals also learn by trial and error that performing a certain action will result in a reward or a punishment. A dog may learn to avoid a particular cat after being scratched on the nose a time or two. When trial and error learning occurs under highly controlled conditions, it's called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was demonstrated in another set of experiments conducted by the American psychologist B.F. Skinner. Here's a picture of what he did. Skinner studied learning in rats by placing them in a special box. Once inside, the rat would explore the box, and occasionally it would accidentally press a lever, and a pellet of food would appear. At first, the rat would ignore the lever and continue to explore in a random way, but it soon learned to press the lever to obtain food. This sort of trial and error learning is of major importance to most vertebrates, and it influences many behaviors essential to survival, such as searching for food. At a level above operant conditioning is the ability to respond appropriately to a new situation without previous experience, called insight or innovation. Here's an example of an octopus. So he's learning through innovation how to open the lid to the jar. There he goes. He got out. For example, the octopus can figure out how to unscrew the lid of a jar and obtain food inside. Actual physical struggles or threatening behaviors between animals are classified as aggressive behaviors. Aggressive behaviors within a group of animals often result in a ranking of individuals called dominance hierarchy. Many animals exhibit territorial behavior. A territory is an area of individuals depend and from which other members of the same species are excluded. In some species, animals perform elaborate behaviors before mating called a courtship ritual. In this controlled experiment demonstrated that female barn swallows tend to prefer mates with longest tails. One hypothesis to explain this result is that a male must be healthy for long tail feathers to develop. Natural selection would favor females, choosing the longer-tailed males. So in the picture you can see that their number of offspring For a male barn swallow's mating success was when the tail extended by gluing, so scientists actually glued an extra tail piece on there. The lowest one was when tails were shortened by cutting. Okay, in the control group were the unaltered tails. One of the most complex social systems is found in honeybees. In the 1940s, biologist Carl von Frisch carried out several experiments to study bee communication, called it the waggle dance.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
The social system of the honeybees is one example of a group of behaviors described as cooperation, in which individuals work together in a way that is beneficial to the group. So, do genes determine most behaviors, or do animals usually learn how to behave from experience? This is the lifelong question. Over the last century, this topic has been debated. Some scientists argue that most behaviors are genetically programmed because different individuals in the same species act in the same ways. Other scientists claim that behaviors are shaped by an animal's experiences. Most biologists who study animal behavior have come to think that animal behavior, particularly the complex behavior of invertebrates, has both genetic and learned components. Investigating the interaction of gene and experience. Here's a case study. An experiment of lovebirds demonstrated that hybrid offspring could alter inherited behavior based on experience. So I guess both scientists were correct. So on the right here, a Fisher's lovebird carries one long strip back to the nest. A peach-faced lovebird turns its head and tucks several short strips under its feathers, then flies back to the nest. The hybrid offspring of both of these behavior is a combination of parents' behaviors. The bird tries to tuck mid-length strips into feathers, but fails. Eventually, the bird learns to carry the strips in its beak. Even so, the bird still turns its head as if to tuck the strips before it flies away. That's a very interesting experiment. The end.